Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone out in Zoom land is well this morning, and you're all very welcome to this latest webinar in Teagasc's Research Insights webinar series. This is a series that we've been running now this is our 7th webinar. It focuses on addressing the challenges and opportunities in the agri-food sector and presenting the latest research that Teagasc has on whatever particular topic we're discussing. So my name is Frank O'Mara. I'm the Director of Research here in Teagasc, and I'm your host for this morning. So today's webinar is the first of a series of 5 webinars over the coming weeks on the subject of land use. And land use is a very important and very interesting topic, and everybody has an opinion on it. Like, for instance, some people would say we should have more land in forestry, others would say we should have less. Some people would say we should have more land in dairying, others would say we should have less. Some people would say land is all about producing food. Others would say that land has lots of other jobs to do as well. So there's lots of questions and opinions and interests in land use. And while policy might like to see land use moving in a particular direction, or scientists might advocate a particular direction for land use, changing land use is very difficult because land is in the hand of private landowners, and they ultimately make the choices about land use. And there's many factors which motivate what choices they make about how to use their land. And there's many barriers that might be there, even if they did wish to change the use of their land. So we're going to explore all those issues over the next 5 webinars, and I hope that you'll be able to come back and join us for each of those. So today we have 3 speakers who are going to explore some high-level perspectives on Irish agricultural land use. We look at historical data to see what has determined agricultural land use choices in the past. We look at data from the Teagasc National Farm Survey that illustrates the economic drivers of the current agricultural land use that we have. And we'll also look then at what are the new environmental demands that are emerging that will influence Irish agricultural land use in the 21st century. We're also delighted that we have the Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity, Dr. Pippa Hackett, with us this morning to launch this series of webinars, and she's kindly agreed to a question and answer session in a few moments, which we'll come to. And then we have 3 speakers that I'll introduce when we get to their turn, and we'll follow that with a question and answer slot for about 15 minutes at the end. And if you want to ask questions, you should use the Q&A function in order to submit your question. And please include the name of the presenter that you want to address the question to, in case it's not very apparent to me. And we may not get to all the questions, and if we don't, we will make answers available on our website afterwards on the Research Insights webinar series webpage. So I'd also like to point out that today's webinar will be recorded, and it will be made available on the Teagasc website. So moving on, as I mentioned, we're delighted that Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity, Dr. Pippa Hackett, has joined us here this morning. You're very welcome, Minister, and thanks for taking time out from, no doubt, which is a very busy schedule. And look, I might kick off. It's the first time we've had the words land use or biodiversity in the title of a minister. So that's a very significant statement, I guess, on behalf of the government. So my first question to you, Minister, might be, as the first, and given that we're talking about land use this morning, as the first minister with responsibility for land use, what are the government's objectives or your objectives with respect to land use?
Hi, Frank. Thank you very much. Actually, just before I start, I'd just like to say I'm delighted to open this series of webinars. I mean, 5 webinars on land use is wonderful, and I'm delighted that Teagasc are looking into this. I think the demands in our land are changing all the time, and I think moving forward there's going to be a pull in all sorts of different directions, as you almost indicated in your opening statement there. But I think on the whole, I mean, we have a very strong affinity with the land in Ireland, and I suppose how we use our land has a profound effect. I mean, whether we're talking about, it could be building houses, it could be roads, it could be infrastructure, it could be greenways, it could be farming in a particular way, or planting trees. They all have an effect, not only on how that land is used, but a knock-on effect perhaps in the environment, in our economy, even in a societal effect. I suppose in agriculture, I mean, I see, look, I'm a beef and sheep farmer myself, and we have some forestry also. So, you know, when I look out over my farm, you know, I suppose maybe 10 years ago, I might have looked out and thought, all right, you know, how many sheep might this carry, or how many cattle could we have in that field over there? But I think we can use our land for more than just food production. We can produce fibers, whether that's forestry or other plants or crops. But our land can also be used to, for example, to prevent flooding. It can be used to store carbon, and it can be used, of course, to you know, restore and support biodiversity. So I think maybe as farmers, we don't always think about the value of our land to society, and maybe that hasn't been recognised yet as a state. And I think in the future we're going to have to recognise, you know, farmers as you know, I mean, we get that whole, you know, we're the custodians of the land, which we are, but it can be in more ways than just food production. I think that's where, you know, the view, really conversation around that needs to happen. And I think, you know, the start of this seminar series is going to be a great start to that. So I look forward to seeing the recordings afterwards.
Very good, thank you, Minister. And you mentioned there many uses of land other than for food production. In terms of what you'd like to see over the coming years, of, you know, new emphasis in terms of on land use, are there any particular priorities among that list? Like you mentioned carbon, you mentioned biodiversity, and so on. I mean, what would your priorities be?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at something even like forestry, which is in a very difficult time at the moment, anyone, you know, who's been trying to apply for a license or even to either plant or to fell, it's a difficult time. And yet I think there's such scope even within forestry. You know, there's always been a view that it's either farming or forestry, and I think there's scope there to adapt to both. I mean, there's a lot of work, you know, not so much here, but in other countries where forestry, such as agroforestry, works really well. You know, so you could still, you know, farm your animals, but you also have trees in your fields, and actually the co-benefits work really well. So, you know, you would also be supporting biodiversity, and you might be, you know, helping the water movement in your land and soil stability. So, you know, I think there's scope in land use in that regard, and in direct relation to farming. I also think that, as I indicated, that value of how we use our land to society hasn't fully really been recognised yet, and we keep hearing talk of, you know, paying farmers for carbon and paying farmers for biodiversity. Yeah, I think farmers on the ground aren't really seeing that. So that's certainly something I want to explore in my role, how we can, you know, reward farmers. I mean, we tend to be moving towards sort of results-based payments, and I think, you know, our Irish farmers are ideally suited to be able to deliver on those, and I think that's really important. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned forestry there. Obviously, that's a big land use in Ireland after agriculture, but we've had a lot of, I suppose, challenges meeting the planting targets over the last number of years. Are there any changes coming down the line that would help support the achievement of our targets?
Yeah, I mean, look, forestry certainly is in a difficult place at the moment. I mean, I was in front of the Agriculture Committee yesterday on forestry, and look, there is a crisis at the moment, but, you know, I'm in my role 4 months, and I've spent probably a lot of my efforts in the forestry aspect of it, and I think we have, you know, in that 4 months, I can see we have made quite big strides, and, you know, we have introduced legislation to make the appeals and licensing process a little bit, you know, more efficient. The department itself has employed, you know, thrown a lot of resources at the licensing issue. So I mean, I think the confidence is low, which is you know, unfortunate, but it's not unexpected. You know, farmers have, you know, maybe a lack of confidence about planting. You know, the sector itself has a low confidence level in terms of timber supply. And in fact, you know, environmentalists have a low confidence also in how we plant the trees and where we plant them. So there's a very broad range, and communities themselves, you know, you only have to speak to people who live in certain parts of the country, Leitrim or parts of Cavan and so forth, the dissatisfaction with the model. So I think there's a huge broad, you know, stakeholder group there. And I'm actually delighted now to say that I'm starting a new forestry policy group, which its first meeting is for timetable for tomorrow. There's a lot on it. It's tried to represent as many stakeholders as possible on that, and hopefully we can start to maybe tease out previous problems, but also look ahead, because we have, we could spend our whole lives looking back at what went wrong and, criticizing. We always have to look forward, and I think that's the important thing now. Get out of this, get out of the mess we're in, and look forward to sort of farming or forestry that brings farmers as well along with it. Ultimately we need them engaged with that, and I think there is great potential in the future for forestry and farming.
Yeah, look, it's certainly a very interesting topic, and it's one that we might come back to in a future webinar as part of this series as well. Just moving on maybe to organics, and as we know in the Farm to Fork strategy from the EU, the target is for 25% of the EU's agricultural land to be in organics by the end of 2030, or the end of this decade. So do you think that's an appropriate target for Ireland, given that we're at such a low level at the moment? And I suppose, does the government have any plans or how we're going to develop a market for that kind of an increase of organic produce without collapsing the market for existing farmers like yourself, Minister, who's been an organic farmer for several years?
Yeah, look, it's a hugely ambitious target. I suppose not so much of your country like Austria, where you're up around 20 or more percent as it is, but I mean, it's huge for Ireland. We're only about 2% of organic land. But look, the demand, I mean, the data suggests the demand for organic produce is very much on the rise across Europe, which is good for us as a nation within Europe moving forwards. And look, customers are being more discerning about, how, where their food comes from and what the production of that food means for the environment, and indeed for aspects such as animal welfare. Look, the programme for government ambitions don't stretch as far as those of the EU, but we did reach commitment to try and reach the EU average, which is about 7.5% at the moment over the course of the government. So that's still quite a sizable increase in land, if we were to achieve that, to go from 2% to about 7.5% in 4 or 5 years. So we have, we are initiating that in terms of, we put an extra 4 million into the organic farming scheme from next year. So that will reopen for new applicants. We expect that might bring in maybe about 500 farmers. The organic strategy developed by the department, identified maybe target areas in it in terms of what particular farmers or farming types to target with that. We'll still have to tease that out as to, you can either produce organic food to deliver for a market, but there's also that public good piece we spoke about in terms of what organic farming can deliver for that, so whether it's biodiversity or improvements in water quality and so forth. So I think the market demand is there. I think it is about accessing that, and that's where we really need some strong will from Board B to unlock those for us, and engagement with the processors, I suppose, in terms of beef and lamb in particular. It can be difficult. Now we're fortunate our own farm, we finish everything, and I think that's probably key to a lot of it. I think if you can finish your own animals, then that helps I think in getting into that market. I mean, there does seem to be a drop off if for people selling weanlings or stores, they don't always end up in the more organic marketplace, and that's difficult, I think, and I acknowledge that. And certainly if there's anything we can do to sort of fix that or improve that in some way, we will. But I think the future is bright for organics, and I think we have great potential here. Certainly we're not saturated with it anyway in terms of our land use, so I think there is great scope there. So again, something I'm quite excited about, and I know a lot of farmers are interested in it. I just know from the ones who contact me, and there has been a lot of queries over the last number of years. When's the scheme opening? So next year it'll be opening.
Okay, very good. And I'm very conscious of the time, Minister. I just wanted to come back to the public goods that you mentioned, that land can provide, as well as food production or forest production. And I suppose, given we all recognise the public goods, I think, or at least most people will be aware of those additional public goods. But given that land is owned by individuals, What's the approach, or what's your thinking about the approach that the government could take to persuade or incentivize those farmers to change their current land use choices?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's at the crux of the issue, because it's all very well and good saying, oh, we should do more of this and more of that. If you're relying on goodwill of people to do it really unrecognized or unsupported, that's sort of unfair at the end of the day. So I think clearly environmental ambition is playing a more significant role at an EU level, and indeed at our own national level, and that seems to be ramping up all of the time in relation to agriculture, and I suppose directly by land use as well. But it can be quite complex, and we've seen from the very lengthy negotiations at the EU level on the new CAP how prolonged that has been. I suppose, look, we hear a lot about, I think every policy decision in agriculture, for me, it has to be able to sort of stand up to some sort of environmental scrutiny. Even farmers on their own farms, if they feel like a particular practice is potentially, damaging to their environment, they can even think about ways of dealing with that. But I think ultimately the state and the government need to really fully recognise that public good and value that. And I can't say that has always happened yet. It's even within the CAP structure, I think it almost needs more supports, because if we are, the Dáil and the Shannon recently, we've declared these biodiversity and climate emergencies, and it affects everyone. But I think a lot of farmers are still, and you get that debate as well. I see it a lot on social media. Look, why are we getting penalised, for example, for our overgrown hedges? There is that clash between the sort of eligible hectare payment and then a pillar 2 payment on an agri-environmental scheme. So I think that certainly needs to be ironed out. I'd like to think we've got scope within our own, as a member state, to do as much of that as we can. But I think it probably needs more than just relying on CAP funds to support this. I think if you look at aspects such as flood defences or nature-based solutions for flooding, for example, farmers have a massive role to play there, and the millions and millions and probably billions we pay, taking towns out of floodplains or trying to, or defend towns. I think for me that would be better off filtered into farmers' pockets, and to support farmers to maybe plant some trees around rivers or on their land that might take up some of that extra water, rather than sort of be more proactive. Now it's very much a longer term vision, but I think we need to take some long term visions, particularly in relation to land use. I mean, it's a slow enough process to change how we use our land, but I think that there is great scope there to support farmers. And look, it's not about stopping them farming, it's about doing a bit of everything. And I think ultimately we have to support farmers to stay on their land, and to support them to keep that sort of generational nature of our farms, which is so really unique still in Ireland, and is actually a selling point for our products as well. But I think we need to look at this in quite a simple way, maybe. I think farmers can help us do that. Engagement with farmers too. They know their land better than anyone else, and they can tell us, well, this probably will work well there, but maybe not somewhere else. But I think just engagement and communication is hugely important too.
Okay, Minister, look, we could talk away for ages about this, because land use is a very, very interesting topic, but I know you have to go to other engagements. So I'd really like to thank you for giving us your time here this morning, and very much to wish you well in your brief as a Minister for Land Use and Biodiversity. Very important. You can be assured Teagasc will help to try to provide the scientific information to underpin all those very, very important decisions that are going to have to be made over the coming years. So we'll thank you with that, Minister, and we'll move on now to our first presenter for the morning. And our first presenter is Dr. Kevin Hanrahan, who is an agricultural economist and head of Teagasc's Rural Economy and Development Programme. His research focuses on the quantitative assessment of the impact of agriculture and trade policies on the Irish agricultural sector using economic models of the agricultural sector. And Kevin is going to give us a high-level history of land use, past and present, looking at aspects from production to forestry, hedgerows, land and biophysical factors. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everybody. And I hope you can all see my screen. So as Frank said there, I'm an economist, and I'm going to be talking to you about a longer run perspective on land use than we might normally take. It's a relatively simple presentation. It's about how land use has changed through history and what's driven that change. Hopefully I've given you a chance to read this quote from Kennedy and Solar, who were the the leading lights in terms of understanding the history of Irish agricultural prices. They have a very good book that I'd encourage you all to read. And they wrote in the conclusions of that book, taking the long view, it is changes in the profitability of different types of farming that determine the pattern of land use and the volume and structure of Irish agricultural output. And that's a nice kind of summation of what I'm going to try to communicate here this morning, thinking about Irish agricultural land use specifically, where we are now and where we have been in the past. And obviously, our agricultural land use is influenced by the characteristics of the soil, topography, and climate. But fundamentally, farmers and farmers' choices are key in terms of determining what the land is used for. And as I said, what I'm going to be talking about are the long-term trends in land use in Ireland, and what are the drivers of those choices that farmers have made historically and are likely to make in the future. And as an economist, I primarily look at this through the lens of economics. My colleague Trevor Donnellan will complement that by again looking at things in detail at the current picture, and also some other issues that drive land use. But where are we now in land use? Land use as of 2019, and this pie chart, I didn't choose the color green. To be honest, this is the Teagasc kind of template for PowerPoints. But over 90% of our land use is in grassland, which is most of the pie here on the right-hand side of the screen. Cereals is the next most important land use, and then other land uses from fruit and vegetables and horticulture, arable and maize silage, and other agricultural land uses are tiny, tiny fractions of our overall land use pie. Now, this is where we are as of today, basically. Where have we been in history? Is this a novel kind of picture? These are data from the Central Statistics Office, and prior to the establishment of the CSO, these data would have been collected by the Irish government and the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction Ireland, the precursor of current DAFM, who've been collecting these data since just before the famine. And we can see that land use, grassland's dominance of Irish agricultural land use is not a new thing. Okay, it's been the way we use land for probably almost 200 years. Now, there are discontinuities in these days, and you can see one here, which relate to periodic censuses of agriculture and basically re-understandings of what is grassland and what isn't grassland. But if we think about this in terms of a share of overall land use, agricultural land use in Ireland over that 170-year period, we can see that grassland has always been dominant, and the dominance of that land use has been increasing over time in that very long perspective. And what's been shrinking is that corn crops use, so that's cereals are barley, wheat, and oats predominantly. And then the red sliver, which has been declining as well over this 170-year period, is what the Central Statistics Office in their Farming Since the Famine publication called green and root crops. And that's basically all other agricultural land uses other than grass and corn crops, okay? And that's also been declining. So why has this been occurring, really, is the question I'm going to answer here in this slide. And this slide has got two panels. On the left are data from that Kennedy and Solar book I kind of started the talk with, and the kind of the endpoint of their study of prices is this one of the endpoints is this ratio of the prices of pasture output, so meat, beef meat, sheep meat, and dairy products relative to tillage output. Now, we don't have national farm statistics on profitability per hectare back into the middle of the 18th century, but we do have prices thanks to the work of Kennedy and Solar. And we can see that the relative output prices, the indices of those two types of output over that period up to just before the First World War was basically in favor of grassland agricultural land use. And in the second panel on the right-hand side, we have data from the Central Statistics Office since the foundation of the state. And the trend that we observed from the middle of the 18th century to the start of the 20th one is more or less continued. Now, you will notice that there has been a turn since the early 1990s, which coincided with the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy that was introduced by the Irish Ag Commissioner Ray McSharry, which basically sort of changed how we use the intervention price system to support agricultural incomes and switch to a direct payments model. But the signal that market prices are a signal has been over a very long period really towards grassland use in Ireland. And unsurprisingly, that's what's happened. And this is a slide just showing what's been happening under the hood in terms of those three key crops that we grow on tillage land in Ireland. And they've been declining over this long period of time, this 170 years since the end of the famine. And what was behind that decline were a number of factors. An important one was the growth of global area in tillage crops. So we think about the expansion west of the Mississippi, Missouri River in the United States, which brought lots and lots of additional land into the growing of these crops from North America. Similar things were happening in South America as well. And so the global supply of crops increased and the price fell. Supply curves shifted out in terms of how economists talk about it. So that was driving a general downward movement in the area of tillage crops grown in Ireland because the prices were disimproving relative to the prices of things you could get out of grassland. Now, there are, of course, occasional upticks in these series, and they coincide with the First World War here and with the mandatory tillage kind of orders that were present in Ireland during the Second World War, what we call the emergency in Ireland. But there are also other things going on in addition to just that supply side story in terms of the global area in tillage crops. There was a demand side story. So until the end of the Second World War, a lot of our transport in Ireland and globally, to be quite honest, was based on horsepower, literally horsepower, and what the fuel for those horses was, in Ireland at least, predominantly oats. But following the Second World War, there was a rapid, basically, carbonization, for want of a better phrase, of that transport system, and the number of horses, which is read off the right-hand side of this graph, declined dramatically, and it basically sucked away the demand for oats, and we switched that land, which we used to fuel our horses, our transport systems, to doing something else, which was really growing grass and farming cattle, sheep on that grass. Now, this change, of course, was reflected also in changes in the farm structure in Ireland. And these two graphs, again, are from the Central Statistics Office. The left-hand graph is in acres and the right-hand graph is in hectares. And unfortunately, we can't easily get them to the same units. But the vertical axis is the same on two graphs. And the first thing is that the population of farms in Ireland has dramatically changed since the middle of the 19th century to 3 years ago, when we had the last farm structure survey. But what's really happened is that these small farm sizes, the farm sizes below 15 acres, have effectively disappeared. And they disappeared in part, at least, because of the fact that tillage land share declined, and tillage was historically a very labor-intensive agricultural activity. And these farmers were very small farmers who were semi-subsistence and worked on the farms that were growing crops, the larger farms. And that demand for labor basically disappeared, and they moved out of agriculture. They emigrated, and they were working in the factories of England and in North America. And that change in the structure of agriculture also is reflected in the declining share of green crops and root crops, because these are the type of vegetables that these farms were producing basically to survive on.
About 1 minute, Kevin.
Thanks. And of course, that's all gets reflected in the differing shares of agricultural output that we produce today and as compared to the past. And what we've done is we've specialized in grassland crops, beef and dairy, and we've reduced our specialization in pigs and poultry and eggs, which were the types of crops that historically were grown by small farmers. So conclusions. Land use is about people reacting to societal signals. So in this context, farmers. And what are those societal signals? Those societal signals are commodity prices and could be taxes and subsidies for other things that we might want farmers to do with their land. The grassland dominance in Irish agriculture is not a modern phenomenon. Recent innovations, such as the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, in some sense, in my opinion, these are not to blame for the kind of land use we have today. It's our demand as consumers for meat and dairy that's driven our land use. We are to blame. Farmers effectively have responded to the signals that we've given them. Now, those signals, those agricultural market price signals, basically signal our desire that the land be used to produce meat and dairy. We now want land use to reflect our new additional priorities, so the new things we want farmers to do with their land. And there fundamentally is a failure of markets here to exist that allow our demands for those new things to be signaled to farmers so that they can respond to them. So fundamentally, if we want in the future our land use to change, the kind of incentives, the signals we send to landowners, and in this case, primarily farmers, has to change if we want to see land use change. So if we want something different done with the land, we have to send new signals to farmers to persuade them, to incentivize them to change that land use. And for more reading, please look at the slides on the Teagasc website after the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. That was really interesting historical perspective on where we have been over the last 100 or 150 years in terms of land use. So I'll move on now to our second presenter, and that's Trevor Donnellan, who is an agricultural economist and head of the Agricultural Economics and Farm Survey Department in Teagasc. And in his presentation today, Trevor will focus on the economic and sociological issues relating to land use in Ireland. Over to you, Trevor.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Frank, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for your interest in this seminar. Kevin has been talking to you up to this point about the long-term history in terms of land use in Ireland. I'm going to take a more cross-sectional viewpoint, looking at land use in Ireland as it is today. And I guess two questions that I want to address within the presentation are, why is land use in Ireland the way it is? I think Kevin's already partially addressed that question. But I want to raise a few issues in terms of why it might be challenging to motivate land use change if it's deemed that land use change is an objective that people see as desirable. So I'm going to talk to you about a range of issues. The first thing on this list here is what I'm not going to talk to you about. I am not going to talk to you about the agronomic properties of land. Land use differs for various reasons, and one of those happens to be its agronomic properties. But as an economist, I'm not the best person to talk to. I'm sure other presentations in this series will talk quite closely to that issue. Instead, what I want to focus on are the other 5 issues listed in the slide here. Issues around farm ownership, the size of farms, whether farms are consolidated or fragmented, characteristics of farmers, and the overall importance of farm profit in household income. So we'll move on and just elaborate on those points individually. So if we think about land ownership status in Ireland, one of the features of the land market in Ireland is that about 15% of the land happens to be rented. Okay, so the operator of the land has actually rented a portion of the farm, or maybe an entire farm in some cases. And land rental has its advantages in the sense that it provides access to land. An individual mightn't have the capacity to purchase land, or land mightn't be for sale in the area. So the fact that there's a land market is important in that regard, and it can help to address land fragmentation issues as well, because it can be possible for example, for a farmer to rent land nearby and maybe rent out land that he might own that's at a distance from the home farm, we'll say. But land rental also has disadvantages. It is inferior to land ownership in some respects also. In particular, it limits the choices that the operator can make and how they use the land. If you're renting land, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to make land use decisions that would, say, involve having to construct farm buildings. That's an issue. And if you wanted to make land improvement measures and you've only got a short-term land rental arrangement, then that's not something you're likely to consider either. or, you know, completely changing the use of the land, say for planting it for forestry. Again, if you're renting land, that's not an option that's open to you. And the state has tried to make some interventions over time to address this issue by encouraging longer term leases, which are more akin to land ownership in some respects, compared to the kind of more traditional land rental model we have in Ireland, which is a con-acre system, which is a very short-term arrangement for land rental. Another important issue is associated with land use is the differential we see in farm size and farm profitability, and the implications that has ultimately for whether different categories of farmers are able to access land. So, you know, if we look across the different farm systems we have in Ireland in the National Farm Survey, we would see that farm size varies depending on the type of farm we're looking at, the type of system the farm's engaged in. And we similarly see differences in profit levels in different farm types. So normally we would say that tillage farms and dairy farms typically have higher levels of income than beef and sheep farms. And these profit differentials also would tend to mean that land use choices are ingrained, I suppose is what we would say, you know, and unlocking that ingrained nature of land use is not something that's going to be particularly easy, because, you know, those substantial differences in the economic profitability associated with using land for different purposes are quite significant. We just look at that here in some simple examples taken from the National Farm Survey. Looking at the slide on the left here, we're just looking at the differences in average farm size. So you see here that the tillage and dairy farms typically are larger than the sheep and cattle farms. We're looking at averages here throughout this presentation. Averages don't tell the whole story, but they're convenient for the 10 minutes that we have here for this discussion anyway, at least. Chart on the right then just simply looks at the proportion of farms across the various categories that have an income level in excess of €50,000. And as you can see here, it's only the tillage and dairy farms that have any kind of significant proportion of farms with an income level of in excess of €50,000 in 2019. You know, and you can see the proportion of sheep and cattle farms achieving that level of income is very low. So those fundamental differences in the profitability of farming and the resources that farmers have available to them are also an impediment in terms of which categories of farmers are likely to be able to gain access to land to use it for a particular purpose. Farm consolidation or fragmentation, you know, these are important issues as well. If you think about inheritance of land in Ireland, the cultural norm is very often for the land to remain within the family. The family name has to be preserved, even if nobody in the family wants to go farming. And in those circumstances, what typically happens is that the farm will be rented out. So the title will remain with the family, even though the family may not be operating it. And, you know, this contributes to the issue of land fragmentation in Ireland, where you have individuals who maybe own land and operate land, and then are also renting land that may not be adjacent to their farm. And again, fragmented farms are farms which have fewer land use options typically. You know, you're not going to be as easily able to operate a dairy farm if it has a fragmented structure compared to a situation where you would have a dairy farm which has a single block of contiguous land. So those are important considerations as well in terms of how our land is used. Farmer characteristics are also important. You know, we see differences across farm types in farmer characteristics, differences relating to education, risk attitude, the age of farmers, you know, the level of educational attainment, how interested farmers are in taking risks, and differences in terms of the typical age of farmers are noticeable across the different farm types. Don't have time to talk about this in detail in the context of the few minutes I have. More formally, people talk about differences amongst farmers in terms of cognitive, dispositional, and social factors, differences around how farmers learn and reason and make decisions, differences around how motivated farmers are by money, which are largely down to issues of personality, and differences how farmers form decisions, who they trust, what they consider as normal, who are the people that influence them. And these are also important characteristics in terms of how farmers make decisions about what they do with their land.
A minute, Trevor, a minute and a half.
Yep. Finally, just coming on to income sources in the farm household. It's important to understand that farm income is not the only income coming into farm households on many farms. And so that's important. What if other income sources are significant? How important is farm income in determining what farmers decide to do with their land? If there is the possibility to earn a higher income through using the farm for a different purpose, is that increase in income going to be significant enough to motivate the farmer to change his land use? And if you just look here at the income that's coming into farm households, the chart on the left is from the National Farm Survey, and that just shows you that there are significant differentials across the farm systems in terms of the level of off-farm employment. We're looking at both here at the farmer having an off-farm job, or the farmer's spouse, as termed in the National Farm Survey, having an off-farm job. And with the exception of the dairy farmer operator, there is a significant level of off-farm employment in agriculture in Ireland. The chart on the right then is coming from the revenue commissioners, and this is based on an analysis of 90,000 cases that the revenue commissioners had to hand in 2018. And that shows that just 27% of the income coming into these farm households was coming from farming as a source. So that just illustrates to you that there's a lot of other income coming into farm households in many cases, and simply increasing farming income may not be substantial in terms of the decision-making process about how land might actually get used. And just to conclude, there are a large variety of factors that are in play in determining how land gets used in Ireland. Agronomic conditions are obviously a very important factor within that, but they are not the only issue that needs to be considered. So these economic and social considerations are also integral to land use decisions. So understand that full complexity across the agronomic, economic and social factors is going to be critically important in terms of understanding land use in this country and how that land use might change if that's something that's deemed desirable from a societal level. And I'll leave it at that, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I think you've given us a good outline of how economic and social factors can be big determinants, really, of the decisions that farmers make around land use. So moving on to our last speaker, and that's Dr. Lillian O'Sullivan, who's a researcher in the Environment, Soils and Land Use Department of Teagasc in Johnstown Castle, and her work is focused on sustainable soils and land use. And today, Lillian will highlight some of the growing demands on land, particularly from the environmental perspective, and some of the challenges and research related to that. So over to you, Lillian.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank, and good morning to everybody who is tuning in this morning. So today I'm going to highlight some of the important services that land provides, some of the research related to that, and as Frank said, focusing more in terms of the environmental perspective, which is becoming increasingly important in the institutional context. And as much as anything, really try to highlight the complexity associated with land use and managing land use for meeting the many different expectations that society is placing on the land. So just to start with, we know at EU scale there is an ambition of climate neutrality by 2050. Here in the infographic, we can see the Green Deal and the two key policy initiatives that have direct relevance for agriculture and food production. So we see the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, and we see some of the key headline targets, such as reducing fertilizer use by 20%, and over on the biodiversity side, that we would have high diversity landscapes on farming land at about 10%. These are headline targets, they're ambitious, but essentially what it reflects is a shift towards more agroecological practices. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this assumes a huge knowledge requirement from a research and advisory and a training perspective. And as these services must be delivered from the same land resource, then it implies that we must start to take more integrated approaches. So to that end, we have started and have been looking in some research at different integrated approaches. And here, this diagram visualizes the key agricultural land-based ecosystem services. So of course, we know that we use the land for food, feed, fuel and fibre, and we really consider it, or have historically, in terms of its productive function. But more and more, we realise and recognise that the land also has that vital role in terms of regulating and purifying water. We hear more and more about the need of the land to sequester and store carbon. We need to provide a habitat for biodiversity and to cycle nutrients. And of course, the land mediates all of these processes, but what we expect is that it needs to do this simultaneously. And reasonably, farmers and land managers, they have been delivering these services for a very long time. However, as the demand to simultaneously deliver more of these is occurring, it's growing, there's a need to take integrated approaches so that we can deliver on these critical services. So far, we've done a lot of component research in Teagasc looking at these different services. For example, here what you see is the Teagasc marginal abatement cost curve for land use and management and carbon sequestration. And just to remind people, a MAC is a graph that visualizes the abatement potential of greenhouse gas mitigation measures and the relative costs associated with each of these measures. And so those are ranked from cost beneficial on the left to the more cost prohibitive measures on the right. And the width of the bar indicates the magnitude of the abatement potential of each of these measures. So here in Ireland, under what's called the flexibility arrangement, up until 2030, we can use the potential of carbon sequestration of the land towards meeting our climate targets, and that equates to 2.68 megatons of CO2 equivalent per annum. And what we see here is that the bulk of the sequestration is associated with forestry. But there are other substantial measures, including optimal management of grasslands, water table manipulation on organic soils, and some tillage management. In terms of the land and nutrient cycling, we also have a long-running soil fertility research program in Teagasc. What you see on the left here is our green book. Essentially, this is our go-to guide. It offers the advice for productive agricultural crops, but also what we have is our online tool, the Nutrient Management Planning, NMP online tool, which allows advisors to work together with farmers to develop spatially targeted nutrient management plans on their farm. And this is going to be more and more important as we move forward to try to make sure that we can minimize any environmental losses, for example, to water quality. And scope is there into the future as new opportunities to harness other data, for example, weather data or other sources of data that could be incorporated into such a system that would allow us to move even further towards precision type nutrient management on farms. And already we have 55 or more than 55,000 farmers engaged and using this tool. So altogether, in terms of these different services, we have a lot of component research going on in other areas also, such as biodiversity and so on. But what is the challenge? So really, the challenge is that if we want to manage the land for multiple services at the same time, it becomes very, very complex. And just to demonstrate this complexity, we calculate indicators for selected land functions that you see here on the right. So we looked at primary productivity, nutrient cycling, climate regulation, and a number of water related indicators, and we completed a spatial evaluation and trade-off analysis. And what you see here in the graph is a simplified correlation matrix for the supply of these services under current conditions across the EU. And what we find is anything that's not a white square or a white box is essentially significantly related. So essentially all of these different services are significantly related. However, they're neither positively nor negatively uniformly related. So of course, this immediately means that there are implicitly trade-offs and synergies between these different services. So just to put that in real terms, if we want to optimize in favor of one service, then it's going to elicit a change in other services that we deliver. So here we optimized in favor of the primary productivity function, and it not only changed the delivery of that, but it also changed or elicited a change between the climate regulation and the water purification function, which went from being positively to negatively related. So really, if you think about this in real terms, if I'm a farmer and I'm on my land and I'm trying to deliver all of these services, then there are a lot of different synergies, but also importantly, a lot of trade-offs that we need to minimize. And it's also important that as we ask farmers and land managers to deliver more and more, that there is a very high degree of complexity associated with that, that we need to try to support through different tools and management options that will reduce the likelihood of any perverse outcomes. So how can we manage these trade-offs?
2 minutes, Lillian.
Okay, so as I said, we need to start taking more integrated approaches. And we have already in one project, the Landmark project, where we took a more integrated approach to the land. We developed a decision support tool that would allow farmers or end users or advisors to input certain data. And that data they could see then by putting in soil, environment, and management type data, it would allow them assess what they're currently delivering. It then also allows them to input their desired outcome. So if they have a particular function or a particular service that they would like to see more of delivered, then they can model towards, they can input that, set that priority, and allow the model then to generate land management options that could support them towards moving towards that direction, towards achieving their desired outcomes. Okay, so in summary, what we see institutionally, there are certainly growing demands on the land. We no longer are able to only think about land in terms of what we expect it to deliver in terms of food and primary production. More and more society expects us to deliver on a suite of different functions. But it's important that the delivery of these ecosystem services is very complex. It's very complex. I've just demonstrated there how there are trade-offs, there are synergies, and we need to find ways to work towards minimizing trade-offs and how can we optimize those synergies. And it's important, I only spoke today from a biophysical perspective, but really what we've already seen this morning is that it's far more complex than that. Also, we have started developing ways to take integrated assessments, and we can build on that existing research as we move forward to try to meet these many expectations. And there are more tools required essentially for sustainable land management. So potentially, is there scope to develop, for example, an integrated marginal abatement cost curve that would speak to all of these different services that we expect the land to deliver? So I'll leave it there and pass you back to Frank, and thank you very much. And there's further reading with the references on the slide, which will be available afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Lillian. And I think you've well outlined how all these other demands on land other than food production, they bring with them great complexity in terms of how we're going to integrate them all into a single land use system, or a single system of farming. So look, keep your questions coming in now. We have a few minutes left for questions, and we'll try and get through those as best we can. So I'd ask my three presenters to keep your answers now as brief and succinct to the questions as you can. A number of the questions are for the Minister, who unfortunately is not with us, but just looking at some of the other questions, and maybe somebody wants to handle this first one, which was for the Minister, but it's about the commitment in the programme for government to undertake a national land use review, and including farmland, forest, peatlands, and so on. Does anybody have any comment on where that's at, or what's envisaged with regard to that?
We don't, to be honest, but I think that what the data show is that we have a very good understanding of what our land is used for currently. I think from the Minister's comments, they want to see change in the intensity of land use, and some land use going into organics and into perhaps more into forestry. And that will change at the margin how we use our land, but not fundamentally. And I think if we want to get bigger changes in that land use review, then we need to fundamentally think about changing the incentive structure. If we're looking at the kind of the ecosystem services that Lillian was talking about becoming more important, well, then that has to be signaled to land use owners and farmers.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Sorry, Frank, if I might just come in related to that, just in terms of these signals, I think it's an important thing to mention that sometimes there's a difference between what the landowner expects and what the society expects. And just to, in terms of these signals, we know, for example, there is an international drive to increase soil organic and carbon with a view to climate regulation under the Paris Agreement. But if you think in the context of Ireland, where our soils are already functionally good at a farm level to deliver on from a fertility perspective, then we have that gap between what the farmer needs functionally versus what society is asking them to do. And that's where things like those signals that Kevin refers to become very important in trying to engender any kind of a shift in respect to that.
Yeah. Okay, Kevin, and another question for you in relation to forestry, and your graph showed the share of agricultural land use in crops and grassland and so on. The question was, where is forestry, or is it excluded from agricultural land use?
Definitionally, it's not part of agricultural land use. But we know that it would be added in the data on forestry land use, that while it increased in the early years of the state with mostly state-funded forestry planting, and there was growth in the late 20th century in farm level forestry, we are still running significantly behind our annual planting targets. So it would be a minor part of the overall picture, and one that is unfortunately not going in the right direction from the perspective of objectives to sequester more carbon in forests.
Okay. Trevor, a question for you. How does Ireland compare to other countries with 15% of land rented?
Yeah, I wouldn't fixate on the percentage of land rented as such. I mean, there are plenty of examples elsewhere in Europe where land, maybe a higher share of land is actually rented. I think what's more of a concern in this country is particularly the con-acre system, the fact that we have these very short duration arrangements, which are very often gentlemen's agreements. I was on a train coming back from Dublin last year, and there was a con-acre agreement being negotiated over the phone by a farmer, as it happened. But so these things are very informal. They're short term, and the fact that they're short term is not ideal. You know, if we are going to have land rental in this country, it would be better if the rental periods were longer, if they were like 10 years, 20-year type rental arrangements. which are more typical in other parts of Europe, because that allows the farmer to operate the land in a manner that's a little bit more akin to what the farmer might decide to do if the farmer actually owned the land outright.
Okay, very good. A question here, are there any ambitions to set up a national carbon trading scheme that would pay farmers annually to manage their land for carbon sequestration? And examples given are afforestation, but also re-wetting peatlands and managing soils for carbon storage. Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can. Yeah, thanks. Well, I suppose in terms of re-wetting already, that's been proposed as part of the Teagasc in the so-called post-2020 cap. But I think there's a lot of move towards trying to develop the infrastructure through research such as this EJP soil program that's EU-wide, where we're trying to explore the opportunities that would allow us to be able to explore what are the possibilities there, and even learning from outside Europe what examples exist that could then potentially be harnessed in the future towards harnessing the potential essentially of the land for carbon sequestration.
It's very.
I think it's, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Kevin. Sorry.
In terms of the economics of it, it's very hard. There are a few kind of nuts to crack before we can set up a market, because we need to basically get very robust measures of what's the sequestration or the associated with a particular farmer behavioral change. If you're going to reward farmers for the carbon that they're sequestering. So we really need to basically, as a buyer, if you go into that market, you really want to be certain that the farmer is actually delivering that ton of carbon, just in the same way as you'd be demanding that you see the animal before you paid for the animal. The nature of this market and why it's so hard to set up is that these things are hard to measure at the scale that would make a market function. So I think that's going to be a challenge, but one I'm sure that our human ingenuity will be able to crack in due course.
Okay, and there was an earlier question was directed to the Minister, but it was around the same topic, and I'm not sure what country it was from, but this attendee said that he understands that land is owned by farmers, it's private, but at the same time it's public goods, and in his country direct payments for multifunction of farmland is implemented, and that has just started. And do we have the same kind of direct payments, and what do we think are the pros and cons of this type of direct payment? So I think the answer.
I think the big challenge for Ireland, say compared to a country like Germany or Switzerland, is that a lot of the public good characteristics of our land are associated with its agricultural use, and most of the use of the goods, the private goods, the food and the fibre are consumed in places like Germany and Switzerland, whereas the demand for the public good aspects is going to be, I expect, a lot smaller, and that's why it's going to be a hard thing for Ireland to address from its own resource. In some sense, these public goods, it's about whether or not they're European public goods and Irish public goods, about how they're funded and how they're supported. I mean, how happy will taxpayers in another place entirely be about supporting biodiversity specifically in Ireland that they never really gain a benefit from, akin to the benefit they get from biodiversity in their own locality?
Okay. And Trevor, I want to direct this question to you. With only 34% of our farms considered viable in the most recent National Farm Survey, the role of profitability, agronomics and economics might now be questioned. I think that speaks to what you were saying, that the farm income is maybe only a small share of the overall income coming into the household. So anyway, the question is, what role do the speakers, and I'll just ask you in the interest of time, feel that information extension services and lobby groups have in influencing farmer choices?
Oh, okay. That's an entire research project. So expecting me to give you an answer off the cuff is a bit challenging. I think I'd go back to the point I made in the presentation, and that is the influences and the information sources and how farmers make their decisions probably does differ between different categories of farmers. Nobody should go away from today's presentation thinking that for some farmers in Ireland, or for all farmers in Ireland, that farm income isn't an important driver of decisions that are made about the farm. I think we can be quite certain that with respect to the types of farming in Ireland that are more profitable and where most of the farm income, or most of the farm households' income is coming from farming, that you know, decisions are being made, you know, with very close attention in terms of new technologies and advice and what best practice should actually be. And okay, there are other farms in Ireland where that isn't a priority. And you know, just expressing a personal opinion, on those farms where it's not a priority, you know, it's difficult to see how that situation could change to a significant extent, you know, through interventions.
But I guess still there's a lot of the land of Ireland where the productivity and the economic return from it is a fairly big influencer of the land use. That's really
yeah. I mean, you know, in the end, the presentation is providing people with averages, and there's a lot of variability around those averages, which we don't really have time to discuss in the limited time available.
Yeah. And look, last question, because we need to wrap it up then. There's a lot of discussion presently about reversing the decline in tillage area. We know the main reason behind this is dairy farmers outbidding tillage farmers for rental land or land that comes up for sale. This means that reversing the decline in tillage area is almost impossible while dairy production or dairy profitability is so high. True or false?
True.
Okay.
True for the timing until something else changes in terms of an environmental constraint or a dramatic change in the profitability of dairying relative to tillage. But for the time being, it's hard to see how that ratio is going to change.
Goes back to your slide that on the historical perspective, the relationship of land use and profitability is high.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, listen, thanks very much to everyone who has attended here this morning and for asking your questions. Thanks very much to our speakers here who have set the scene for the series of 5 land use webinars that we're going to have, and they've given us very useful information and background as to what are the drivers of land use and the challenges about changing it. Our next webinar is on this day fortnight, the 2nd of December, and it's going to be about making the most of our land, and it's going to focus on the production function of land, whether that's for crop production, for grass production and livestock, or for forestry. And we look forward to welcoming you to that webinar in a fortnight's time. So that's it for this morning, and good luck with the rest of your day, and thank you for attending.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.